We want to begin with an update to a story that's been making national headlines. A family of 8 dead in our Grand Haven Township neighborhood after a suspected murder-suicide. Paige Meyer has the update after hearing from investigators.
3 weeks before investigators say Kristopher Karolkiewicz killed his wife and 6 children, he quietly lost his job. Nobody has publicly explained why. That unanswered question is now one of several disturbing details at the center of a Michigan investigation into what happened inside a home in Grand Haven Township.
Investigators have now identified the 8 family members found dead inside of a Grand Haven Township home last week and have determined how they've died. I'm Paige Meyer here at the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office, where detectives revealed Monday that this was a murder-suicide.
Authorities have ruled the deaths of Kristopher Karolkiewicz, his wife, Amanda Karolkiewicz, and their 6 children a murder-suicide. But the story didn't begin with the fire. It began weeks earlier, with a timeline that looks very different once every confirmed piece is put in order. If you're new here, subscribe. We follow the evidence from beginning to end. This is the confirmed timeline investigators, public records, and family statements have left behind.
The investigation at this point shows that this was a murder-suicide, with the fire being started after the murders.
Ottawa County Sheriff's Captain Jacob Sparks has given several briefings since the bodies were found. Autopsies at Corwell Health Blodgett determined all 8 family members died from gunshot wounds. Investigators concluded Kristopher shot and killed his wife and all 6 children, then turned the gun on himself. Mandy and the children's deaths were ruled homicide. Kristopher's was ruled suicide. The gun was registered to him. Evidence at the scene indicated no one else had fired it. Michigan State Police arson investigators determined the fire had been set deliberately in multiple locations throughout the house, including the main floor and the basement, with the basement showing heavier damage. Investigators believe the fire was started after the killings, not during them. The people were already dead. The fire came after. Based on early evidence, including reports of a smoke smell earlier that morning, investigators believe the killings may have started the night before, sometime Thursday evening, stretching into the early hours of Friday. No note was found. Sparks confirmed a substantial amount of documentation was seized from inside the home, and that going through it would take time. The case remains open. The children were found spread across the home, some in basement bedrooms, others on the main floor. All the family's pets died in the fire too. But investigators weren't finished. The crime scene explained how the family died. It didn't explain why. For that, they had to go backwards. That's where the timeline changes. That's the confirmed sequence. What it doesn't explain is how a family that looked, from the outside, completely fine, ended up here.
A family member, Emily Jones, also says she's grateful for.
I would ask people to keep in mind that Mandy was a real person. And she had a family that loved her and that misses her. And those 6 children, they didn't even get the opportunity to grow up. Traveling all the time. And she was brave taking 6 kids on some of these trips. They had gone in June on an adventure in Canada. She was just the sweetest, funniest person that you could ever meet. And she was a light in her community, a light in her family.
Amanda Karolkiewicz went by Mandy. She was 39. She worked as a substitute teacher for Grand Haven area public schools. And in January, the district had recognized her for it, naming her a premier substitute at Peach Plains Elementary. She had 6 children, 4 sons, 15, 12, 11, and 5. 2 daughters, 11-year-old twins named Ella and Caroline, adopted from China. A week before she died, Mandy posted videos online from a trip she'd taken with her daughters back to China. In one clip, she's dressed in traditional Hanfu clothing, hair and makeup done, calling it the coolest experience of her life. She wrote about how proud she was of her daughter's heritage. The family flew home on July 17th. She was also a writer in a small but meaningful way. She wrote a children's book called The Magical Mantra about learning to see the good in yourself and dedicated it to each of her kids by name.
We have grandparents that are grieving. We have cousins that are grieving. We have schoolmates that are grieving. keep that in mind as you're making your comments.
Her husband, Kristopher Karolkiewicz, was 47, National Vice President of Sales and Marketing for the American Heart Association, a role he'd held since September 2023, working remotely, supporting the division behind CPR and first aid training. He had no connection to the AHA's Michigan operations. He simply lived there. On paper, this was a family doing well. Then another detail surfaced, not from investigators, from Mandy herself. Before her death, Mandy appears to have been active on Reddit under a username local journalists later confirmed belonged to her, matching details about her marriage, her kids' ages, her job, her town. Most of it was ordinary, comments about teaching, her kids, small-town life. One post stood out. It was in a support forum for people recovering from infidelity in their marriage. She wrote that she and her husband had been in what she called the process of recovery for 4.5 years. She used shorthand common to that community, EA for emotional affair, PA for physical affair. She wrote that he still claimed to that day it had only ever been emotional. She said she never quite believed him. The evidence, she wrote, made it seem unlikely it had stayed that way. Infidelity and marital breakdown are among the most common threads running through Familicide research. Combine that with a professional collapse, and you get exactly the kind of pressure cluster researchers describe again and again in these cases. A local domestic violence expert was asked to weigh in, and what she said reaches beyond this case. Suzanne Katerberg, a crisis and supportive services coordinator at a domestic abuse center in nearby Holland, cautioned against jumping to conclusions before the facts were confirmed. But she made a broader point. People are consistently shocked when violence like this happens somewhere that looks safe. Her response was blunt. Domestic abuse happens in every kind of community, wealthy or struggling, urban or small town. A peaceful street tells you nothing about what's happening behind a specific front door. She also pushed back on the idea that children being involved should have made this less likely. Research suggests the opposite. Children aren't incidental in these cases. In many of them, they're the primary target. The marriage was one piece of the timeline, but it wasn't the only one. Investigators also discovered something that happened just weeks before the killings. It wasn't hidden in a journal or a social media post. It was hidden in his employment history. The job that ended the American Heart Association told multiple outlets that Kristopher's employment ended earlier in July, weeks, possibly just days, before the killings. They confirmed his dates and his title. They wouldn't confirm why. We don't know if he was fired, laid off, or something else. What we know is the timing. A senior executive working from home loses his job, and weeks later, according to investigators, kills his entire family. There's a real body of criminology research on cases where a father kills his spouse and children, often himself too. One British study tracking family annihilators across 3 decades identified 4 recurring types. The self-righteous offender, who blames his partner for the family falling apart and kills to punish her. The disappointed offender, who feels the family failed to live up to some image he had of it. The anomic offender, tied to financial collapse, someone who's lost his role as provider and can't face what that means. And the paranoid offender, driven by delusional fears, often that someone is coming to take the family away from him. None of that tells us what Kristopher Karolkiewicz was thinking, but it does explain why investigators and researchers kept returning to the same questions. It's why that unexplained gap in his employment keeps getting mentioned. As all of this spread online, a lot of it speculative, Mandy's sister, identified in reporting as Cessna, posted something on Facebook that reframes how this whole story should be handled. She wrote that people shouldn't treat online theories as fact. She asked people to scroll past the speculative stories rather than share them. She said her family already knew what had happened, and that anyone with real respect for her sister would wait until the investigation allowed those details to come out properly. She also talked about the outpouring of support, hundreds of messages, from people who knew Mandy and strangers who didn't. saying she hadn't had the capacity to respond to everyone, but wanted them to know how much it meant. A woman who just lost her entire sister's family was watching strangers build narratives online about her final hours. What she asked for wasn't sympathy, it was patience. Grand Haven Township isn't a big place, and losing an entire family, 6 of them kids enrolled in local schools, hit it hard. Grand Haven area public schools, where Mandy substitute taught, started offering counseling to students and staff almost immediately. St. Patrick's Parish held a rosary prayer service, describing a community deeply affected by the tragic loss of the Karolkiewicz family, and opened it to anyone, regardless of whether they'd known the family personally. Donations came in for extended family members left to handle funeral arrangements for 8 people at once. People who'd never met the Karolkiewiczes described the same reaction over and over, disbelief that this could happen somewhere that felt safe. That's exactly the reaction domestic violence experts say they hear constantly, and exactly the assumption they keep trying to correct. What decades of research tell us about cases like this? This isn't an isolated phenomenon. There's a name for it in criminology, familicide, sometimes called family annihilation. A parent, overwhelmingly a father, kills his spouse and 1 or more children, often followed by his own suicide. Researchers who've studied dozens of these cases keep finding the same thing. They are almost never truly sudden. One widely cited study going through family court records, police files, and interviews with survivors found that in nearly every case examined, there had been observable warning signs beforehand, a history of controlling behavior, explicit or veiled threats, obsessive fixation on the relationship. In some cases, prior stalking, prior violence, even what researchers describe as rehearsal behavior, small actions that, looked at afterward, seem like someone testing the edges of a plan they hadn't fully committed to yet. Domestic violence researchers point to a specific cluster of risk factors that push a relationship into what they call a high lethality category. A history of coercive control, one partner managing the other's money, monitoring their contacts, restricting where they go and who they see, threats involving weapons, access to firearms in the home, a prior strangulation incident, threats of suicide made by the abusive partner as a form of control. When several of these show up together, researchers say the statistical risk of the relationship ending in violence climbs sharply. There's also a pattern in what happens after. It's commonly assumed these men either turn themselves in or force police into a standoff. The research says the opposite. Across large samples of familicide cases, the overwhelming majority of offenders attempt suicide, most of them immediately or within hours. Standoffs are rare. That detail matters because it undercuts the idea that these acts are pure rage, a switch flipped in the moment. A lot of them, according to researchers who've studied the planning behind these crimes, aren't impulsive at all. The offender's own death is built into the plan from the beginning. None of this tells us with certainty what was happening in Kristopher Karolkiewicz's head in the days before July 24th. But it tells you why the details that surfaced, a job that ended with no public explanation, an account describing years of trying to recover from a betrayal she never fully believed he'd admitted to, a fire set deliberately after the killings rather than during them, are the details investigators and researchers keep coming back to. It would be easy to file this away as one isolated tragedy on one street in one township. But every researcher who studies this says the same thing. These cases follow patterns, and patterns can be recognized before they finish playing out. That doesn't mean every job loss ends like this. It doesn't mean every marriage recovering from an affair is headed for violence. The overwhelming majority aren't. But domestic violence advocates argue that understanding the real risk factors, coercive control, access to weapons, threats of self-harm, a sudden and severe collapse of someone's identity or status, matters more than most people think. Often, it's not police or courts who are positioned to notice these signs first. It's friends, co-workers, neighbors, family. Mandy's sister asked people not to spread speculation about her family, and that request deserves to be respected. But understanding the broader pattern these cases tend to follow isn't speculation about the Karolkiewiczes specifically. It's information advocates say can genuinely help someone recognize danger in their own life or in someone else's before it's too late to do anything about it. Investigators may eventually explain every step that led to that night in Grand Haven Township. But one question will probably outlive the investigation. Were there moments, weeks earlier, that if recognized for what they were, could have changed how this story ended? That's the question researchers continue asking after every familicide, and it's the one that matters long after the headlines fade. If any part of this sounds familiar, a partner's escalating control, threats involving weapons or self-harm, a relationship that feels less safe every year instead of more, please don't wait on it. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available. The Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available 24 hours a day by call or text. If this kind of careful, fact-checked coverage is what you want more of, please subscribe.